We continue now at the top of Daf Kuf Dalet Amud Beis in Meseches Bava Basra. This is Bava Basra Daf 104b. And the previous Amud, the Gemara brought the Mishnah which said that if the amount of land the seller gave the buyer extra was 9 kav, so then when the seller wants the buyer to return the land, the seller cannot demand money instead of the land. Since the land is a significant amount of land, the buyer will just return the excess land. And the Gemara on the previous Amud brought a machlokus between Rav Huna and Rav Nachman. When we're talking about this extra land of 9 kav, does that mean to say that the amount of land extra was also in terms of percentage, it was greater than that percentage of rova lasa, of a quarter of a kav lasa, and it was 9 kav, and that's why it's returned? Or do we say that anytime there's 9 kav extra of land, even if it represents a very small percentage of the entire amount of land that was sold, still, since it's a significant amount of land, that is returned to the seller? And again, that's a machlokas amoroim. Rav Huna said the 9 kav is always returned to the seller, it doesn't matter what the percentage is. But Rav Nachman here continuing says, if it's at the percentage that we say the sale goes through, then the sale goes through. However, v'ika milsi yisera, but if it's already more than that, latishas kav in hadri, so then already if it's 9 kav, then it's returned. But again, that has to be where it represents a percent of the sale that is significant enough that the buyer has to return to the seller. And the Rashbam explains, v'ika milsi yisera lites kav in kilomar, im yesh mashu yoser me rova l'chol sa, if you have something more than the percentage of 1/4 of a kav per sa, the hashta leka mechila klal, where at that point in time we say that the amount in excess is not forgiven, lo b'revoin v'lo b'mosrein, not in terms of the excess of the quarter kav per sa or whatever was beyond that. So then chazin ani hava kurayim, so then we have to see if the total sale was 2 kor, the hashta hava lehu rivin didhu yoser mitas kav, and at that point the extra is then going to be more than 9 kav. Kavan deleka mechila, since the amount extra is a percentage where there's no mechila, it's not forgiven. So hadri bi'anpe nafshayu. So then already you return the actual land, as we said. The kavan deika chashiva sada, since that's enough to be considered a field. Lo tiknu chachamim lamocher yipoy koach demo. So there the chacham don't say that the seller can demand money. Eliyachzer lo karka. Rather, if the buyer wants, then he can return land. And the Rashbam continues, v'lo hava hach mechira la base core. Let's say, for example, the totality of the sale was just land that was a base core. However, v'ika kavu mechsa yesar l'ravoin, but let's say the amount in excess of the quarter kav per sa was another kav and a half. The havalahu bein hakol tes kav, and there also, if it adds up to a total of 9 kav, so hadr again, so then it will be returned. Again, the point over here is that according to Rav Nachman, the amount of land that has to be extra has to be enough that there's no mechila, meaning according to the percentages of a quarter of a kav per sa, and then also if it adds up to 9 kav, again, it's considered to be a field on its own, and the land itself is returned. And the Gemara continues, Eisvei Rava Rav Nachman. Rava asks Rav Nachman the following question. It said in our Mishnah, Shim Shayir Besada Beis Tishas Kav, and again, if the amount in excess by a field was 9 kav, so then it's the land that is returned. And so the Gemara initially assumes, Lav Dezavin Le Kurayim, isn't the case over here where he sold 2 kor, and 9 kav out of 2 kor is not actually the percentage where there's no mechila, and apparently still the land is returned. And the Gemara says, no, not necessarily. Lo, no, Dezavin Le Kor. Maybe the case in the Mishnah is that he sold him only a kor of land, in which case 9 kav is certainly going to be more than the percentage of mechila, and therefore that's why we say that it has to be returned to the mocher. And in this case, since it's 9 kav, again we say land is returned. That's how you could interpret the Mishnah according to Rav Nachman. And the Gemara continues along the same lines. The Mishnah said uvegina beis chatzi kav. When we're talking about a garden, what's considered an important amount of land is a half a kav. And again, the Gemara says lav dezavan le sasayim. Isn't the situation where the total amount of the gina that was sold was 2 sa, and then again this would be a very small percentage, and we would say still it has to be returned, even though it seems to be such a small percentage that there would be mechila. That seems to be like Rav Huna. And the Gemara says, lo, no, the zav and le sa. The case could be that he sold only a sa, and therefore again the amount of land over here is in excess of the amount that there would be mechila, and that's why it's returned. That's how Rav Nachman would understand it. And the Gemara continues along the same lines. The Mishnah then said, uchedivrei Rabbi Akiva beis rova. According to Rabbi Akiva, by a gina, an important amount of land is a rova, is a quarter of a kav. The Gemara says, my lav the zav and le sa. Again, is it not that we're talking where a sa was sold? And the Gemara says, lo, no, the zav and le chatzi sa was only half a sa that was sold in totality. So again, that rova is going to represent an amount where there is no mechila. That's how Rav Nachman would understand the Mishnah. And the Gemara continues, boy, Rav Ashi asks the following question. Sada v'nasis gina, let's say you have a field, but it turns into a gina. What that essentially means, the Rashbam says, is that there was an irrigation channel that was now brought to this field, which allows it to be used as a gina, as a garden. A garden requires more irrigation. irrigation. And so in that situation, now suddenly that amount of property really, it might have been an amount of property that would not have been useful as a sada on its own, but it is useful as a gina on its own. Or let's say the other way around, gina, let's say originally it was a gina, v'nas sada, but now it's a sada, you don't have the water anymore. So in that situation now, again, the land would have been valuable at this amount because it was a gina, but now it no longer is. So can we say in that situation that the buyer just returns the land and not money? What would be the halacha? And the Gemara says teku. The Gemara leaves that as a question. And the Gemara continues, Tana, it was taught, let's say this field that was sold is near the seller's other field, and so now the buyer says, I want to return the property to you, I don't want to return money, and it's fine, because the property I'm returning is right next to your other property, so the fact that it's a very small piece of property doesn't make it useless, because you can just annex it to your current property. That's exactly what the Brisa says, afilu kolshu, even if it's a small amount of land, machzer lo karka, the buyer can return land to the seller, he can't be forced to return money, because again, the buyer can just say to the seller, this land is perfectly useful, because you can annex it to your existing property. And the Gemara continues, Boy Rav Ashi asks the following question, Bor, let's say you have a pit that separates between his current property and this little piece of land that's going to be returned. Ma'u shetafsik, is that considered a hefsik? Is that considered to be like a separation, in which case the seller can say, I don't want the land back because it's not really attached to my property? And similarly, amas hamayim, let's say you have an irrigation channel, ma'u shetafsik, is that a hefsik? Derech harabim, if you have some kind of path for the public, ma'u shetafsik, is that considered an interruption, a hefsik? Richva dedikla, let's say you have a row of palm trees, ma'u shetafsik, is that considered a hefsik? And the Gemara says teku, the Gemara leaves that as a question. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The end of the Mishnah said, "V'lo esarova bilvad machzerlo." He doesn't only return the excess land of a quarter kaf per saw. Elakol moser, he returns all of the extra. And we noted when we learned the Mishnah, this seems a little backwards. What it should have said was, you don't return. Not only do you return what was excess beyond the quarter kaf per saw, you even return the quarter kaf per saw. And that's why the Gemara asks klape lai. This seems to be going in the wrong direction. And the Gemara says, yes, you have to amend the Mishnah as follows: Tani Ravin bar Rav Nachman taught. It should read as follows: Loes hamoser bilvad machzerlo. He doesn't only return the excess, eles kol harevon kulan. He also returns all those quarter kaf per saws as well. If you read the Mishnah in that way, then it makes sense. Not only what was beyond the percentage of mechila, but once he's already returning, he has to return all of the extra land. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, Mida bechevel ani mocher loch hein chaser ein yeser. Let's say the language the seller uses is, he says, I'm selling it to you as measured by a rope, meaning an exact amount of land, but then he throws in, it might be a little less, it might be a little more. So the Mishnah says, Bitel hein chaser ein yeser mida bechevel. So then the later phrase takes precedence. It nullifies the earlier phrase, meaning the phrase of hein chaser hein yeser nullifies the mida bechevel phrase, and really what he means to say is that it might be a little less, it might be a little more. It's not exact. Let's say it's the other way around. Let's say he says it might be less, it might be more, but then he says it's going to be as measured by the rope, it's going to be exact. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Kuf Hey Amud Aleph.